Hello, and welcome to an adventure like no other. Far more than what you have known, there is something far more to be known than you can ever know. And it is all about you, the real you, your real awareness with your intuitive senses. You were never taught that the real you, your real awareness, is operating 5 bodies in cause and effect, restricting creation. You have been taught to think that you are only a one-dimensional human person, with a mind and emotions, and with a very short lifespan on this planet Earth. More than what your mind can grasp is your intuitive senses that can be opened to see beyond all your restrictions. You have always had an opening to see beyond what you have known, and this has been purposely kept from you, and this is where you have heard rumors and stories about your nightly dreams. Your so-called dreams is your opening to your intuitive senses that will allow you, the personal you, to excel beyond what you have previously known. Everyone has intuitive senses, and very few people take advantage of what is possible by recognizing something more than their mind can understand. Creation has its place for all of us, and then there is all life, which is far more than anything than what can become with creation. Everything we experience is necessary for us to survive with whatever we choose and decide our life to be. New Kevin Smith is the great witness to something more than what can be taught and learned in any school. It can be so that when anyone first listens to Kevin's intuitive side experiences, also known as real side experiences, from what their personal mind has known, Kevin's manner of expression will at first be rather different to comprehend. This is where this introduction and reading the new books and Facebook groups will help. Have fun deciding. DUANE the Great Writer and Seer.
In this real side experience, I would find myself in the recreated house of my deceased grandfather, who on the physical level would have been my mother's father. On a number of previous real side experiences that I have shared, I would reveal that my grandfather's house would in fact be utilized as a place of a meeting where I and the guides and DUANE would often converge, and where discussions as to the various assignments and galactic projects would take place. The guides have a tendency to assume the forms of the parental figures and older siblings of the new friends when encountered on the real side, and for me it is the external form of my grandfather that the guides will assume, and where impressions via the real awareness will assure the personal self that it is indeed a guide operating in the guise of my grandfather, as opposed to the genuine individual whose awareness once animated through the body type on the physical level, or say perhaps a dark force character attempting to deceive through the use of the forms of individuals known to us. The real awareness is a part of the isness everything. This everything is through all consciousness effected form and feature, regardless of the formulation of the secondary personal self, and where the personal self takes on the consideration that as all simulation of a form seems separated from its own body type, this suggests segregation and individuality, whereas in reality everything is this one isness awareness. And ultimately it is the all is playing simulated games with itself, with all the created body types, and self-isolated and disconnected from the real awareness isness that they are, personal self-consciousness constructs in operation, all for the purposes of the is constantly expanding recognition of its own endlessness, that as each real awareness determines recognition of the true reality it actually is and a part of, through the comparison that everything creational provides, which is the actual reason for the simulators, this becomes a greater recognition the is has of its own endlessness, and this is the ultimate and real purpose of life. The real awareness, then, part of the isness that is through all consciousness, despite perhaps not recognizing it as yet, still will have access to every idea that all consciousness comprises of, that which is behind and effect generating everything simulated in our experiential midst. All deception then is laid bare, as all intent behind the surface simulated front can be determined, and the actuality of the awareness that is animating through the body types in our presence can be realized, be it the real guides or a shape-shifting reptilian. On this occasion, however, somewhat a rarity, but the recreated deceased grandfather's house was not the meeting location, but the genuine reconstituted physical level building my grandfather once lived within, featuring on the real side. The recreated houses of individuals generally represent their consciousnesses on the real side, and so everything that each individual's consciousness construct consists of, the ideas that comprise it, will be present within the building, the agreements and emotional attachments that have been established and are constantly affecting as experience and physical level lifetimes. That despite my grandfather's body form expiring and his transitioning from the physical, he is not then liberated from the consciousness. For until we decide to set intent with the recognizing of the all is, which involves extrication of attachment from the ideas of the consciousness, we will remain anchored by it, our recreated consciousness representing houses, rather follow us symbolically as we vacate awareness from the physical level body vehicles as they expire, and move on to whatever position we have established for ourselves, according to the ideas we hold to that have effected our self-created fate. My grandfather's physical level body died 30 or so years ago, and although nothing would be revealed as to his current position, if he was perhaps, say, still lingering on the astral level, the next automatic position from the physical for most, as the vast majority are physical astral based in regards to their focus, attention, and through the general inclination of consistent sensation gratifying above everything else, the sensations being the domain of the astral body and subsequent level, or if perhaps he had established another physical level lifetime and body type, fitting the category of a one-dimensional and completely consciousness-absorbed individual, he would be featuring in the experience within his consciousness representing recreated, human earth-based physical level house. And perhaps, if he were to become as a completely different species, the representation would be the same, and whatever was the equivalent of a home with whichever species now assumed would still be recreated and symbolically represent the consciousness on the real side. As I mentioned, contained within the house will be all that the consciousness comprises of, including the emotional attachments to the ideas of others we hold to, for indeed present also would be his daughter, my mother, and my deceased grandmother, who on the physical was his spouse. Until we do efface and release the consciousness in its entirety through the process of awareness, the New You song, and the assistance of the guides, we hold to its complete construct, every idea that affected every simulated situation, lifetime, and every encounter we had with all other individuals that have featured throughout our lifetimes. We will be unconscious then of much of that which is constantly in effect, for only the current lifetime of affected experience will be memory vehicle stored, as each lifetime heralds a new body vehicle, and where everything that had previously transpired is stored in the backup filing system, the subconscious. But despite our being unaware of that which is contained within the subconscious, still affected will be the ideas it comprises of. And as ideas are held to, always, we are potentially their effects, and where any individual we ever had association with can enter our experience, physical level and real side other dimensionally, at any moment of their choosing. We consciously will apply emotion to that which we have experience effect generated for ourselves, and as we do so, we enhance the idea to a greater degree, it becomes more intense, more poignant, and more likely that its nature be expressed again in future lifetimes. Ideally, we endeavour to experience what we decide, but regard it with the detached, real awareness, nowness, indifference that all experience really deserves, as everything creationally occurring is merely reference comparison, for all is recognition. But most will not only experience what they have in actuality created for themselves, consciously or subconsciously, but will apply additional emotional reaction ideas that become packaged with the initial idea effecting as experience and consciousness installed, whereas I said, due to the emotional component, the idea has a greater chance of featuring again over the ideas we place little regard or interest with. My grandfather served in the forces during the Second World War, an intense experience that would have elicited emotional reaction and response, for regardless of the emotion created, be it categorized as good or bad, it is still emotion and will enhance the idea that is subsequently consciousness installed. For indeed, it seemed that I had frequented my grandfather's house and presence at a moment where the D-Day celebrations were taking place, despite this real side experience taking place many weeks after this commemorative day had passed on the physical. My grandfather held to the notion of honouring this day, even with him having departed the physical level earth, and all discussion seemingly had to be in reference and relevance to the war. I wasn't particularly taken with this idea, and refused to go along with the general war-related theme of conversation, much to the disdain and disapproval of my grandfather and the annoyance of his spouse and daughter, my mother. I would attempt to reveal to my grandfather the reality of cause and effect creation, how every idea we cling to will generate its subsequent nature into continuous future lifetimes, until the idea, and indeed all ideas of consciousness and creation, are emotionally relinquished. My words were not well received, dismissed and disregarded by my grandfather, grandmother, and mother, and so I would abandon my effort, content were they to remain with the personal self-consciousness and embracing of their restrictions. Interestingly, my grandfather had one entire wall of the interior of his house dedicated to a collection of clocks, of which he and his wife seemed very proud, perhaps simply a further verification of how he was locked into the time phases of the consciousness, as the clocks were featuring within what was his consciousness representing house after all. My grandfather had another keepsake in his possession. It seemed to be the torso of a dead German soldier that he kept stored in a bag, and on departure of the house I would elect to take this less than charming item with me, as though unable to impress upon him the effects he will be manifesting for himself in some shape or form, through the overall attachment he had with his war experience, I was able to at least relieve him of one of the ideas in association with it. Perhaps a German he had killed during the war, and that he didn't seem to notice my removing of this bag suggested an idea he had rather disregarded, but an idea that would still be part of the overall consciousness installation of the entirety of the war affair, an overall experience that eventually would become subconsciously placed, and where he would be then unconscious of, but still the effects in regards to. I would relocate momentarily to my own recreated consciousness representing physical level house, and as I opened the bag, the German torso had become a shark, and despite there being no water present as a medium by which it could operate, it would as though be swimming around the room I was in, and present as a danger to anyone getting too close. It was as though that very likely a German had been killed by my grandfather during the war, and with such an emotionally charged experience, so the German may have harboured all manner of a created reaction to his demise, rage, resentment, bitterness, and all directed at his killer, that although in future lifetimes the former German now would be unconscious of this experience in relation to my grandfather, it still would be subconsciously placed with the emotion in relation to my grandfather that has it somewhat enhanced. As I mentioned, every encounter we have with others is through the ideas of them being present in consciousness that allow for our effected experience with them, and as all ideas are maintained by the personal self-immersed individual, potentially every individual we ever had association with can feature in our experiences again, and if our association with them excited emotional reaction, and the idea attachment with them is subsequently charged and enhanced, this increases the chance of our encountering these specific individuals again. In regards to my grandfather and the German, although their next meeting may then be in completely different circumstances, body forms, and creational positions, and from their personal self-considerations, they may never have met before, underlying this will be the subconscious recognition of each other and the emotions of disdain and resentment in association, and however that may then express as a motivation for their behaviour in relation to each other. How many times have we encountered individuals for seemingly the first time, and yet they have a familiarity as though we had known them forever, and where we may have instant dislike for certain individuals, even though they have done nothing to merit such reaction. The German's final emotional outpourings of rage and resentment had warped his consciousness, distorted it more so that in subsequent lifetimes he would be a very unapproachable, antagonistic, and unsociable character represented here as he swam about the room of my house in the form of a shark, poised to strike anyone entering his midst, though he seemed oblivious of my presence, as though locked in the enclosed bubble of his created rage and want to lash out. Regardless, I would vacate my house and return to the house of my grandfather. The only other individual featuring would be my mother, his daughter, and he would be speaking in regards to his own father. For as the story revealed, his father, who would be then my great-grandfather, was a collector of antiquities, valuables, and collectibles during the early turn of the 20th century. He had secured a selection of rare and sought-after children's books, but as he examined the book's contents, he would discover one of them was absent of its expected content partway through, and in its place were all manner of scientific formulae and information. How this had come to be, and by what hand, was never made apparent, but the information revealed was of such an advanced technological and scientific nature that it was well in excess of that which featured in the early 1900s, and captivated the imagination of his father, that he would abandon his passion for collecting and pursue the application of the information that had fallen into his hands. So devoted was he to this new cause, that with unbridled determination and perseverance, he was eventually able to unlock the secrets of the scientific information, and within the basement under his house he would construct a laboratory to facilitate his projects. For through his dealings with antiquities he had accrued rather a considerable wealth. A man of means he could well be described as, and channeled his resources into his scientific work. The information he had acquired was in regards to other dimensions, alternative time periods, and the ability to access them through a scientific application, and as he made progress, so he would be noticed by the dark forces operating at that era in human history, as indeed they always have been present, orchestrating human affairs since the human species' inception. For should one of the human slaves stumble upon or create something of value to the controllers, they will be swift to intercede, to either buy off the individual through financial incentive or threat, or if that fails, simply eliminate the individual and steal what they have created for themselves, that now will serve the dark forces and their controlling agendas. This would be the case with my grandfather's father, and where he would willingly submit to the dark forces and work on their behalf, as he created various portals and conduits that allowed access to alternative dimensions and time periods within the basement lab of his house. This was indeed fascinating, for on a series of real-side experiences I shared a while ago, revealed to me would be how my great-grandfather, my father's grandfather, and not the great-grandfather that was my mother's grandfather, as was the case in this current experience, had been of a scientific persuasion, a secret he had maintained throughout his life, and where his work was of a similar nature. But when the dark forces demanded his acquiescence, he would create a portal and retreat to an alternative creational position, taking his research with him, abandoning the basement lab of his house where he worked. But as explained by a guide in that real-side experience, he had left clues that his grandchildren, my parents, or indeed great-grandchildren, myself, could potentially decipher to determine how to activate a portal that still was present in the basement of his abandoned house and find him. For the guide revealed that he was still alive and his technological genius could be valuable in regards to our physical level projects. And so, as it transpired, both my great-grandfathers were involved seemingly with highly advanced scientific work and research, one of which, my mother's grandfather, had worked on behalf of the Dark Force controllers, the other, my father's grandfather, had denied the controllers and fled to a safe alternative dimensional location, but having left a trail of breadcrumbs, so to speak, where potentially I could find him. I would ask of my grandfather now, who was relating this story of his father, if we could visit the house where my great-grandfather once lived, specifically the basement where his laboratory had been. He would agree, and despite my mother's evident trepidations as to this course of action, she would elect to accompany us. My grandfather warned me, however, that all the men on his side of the family tree were rather sensitive to other dimensions. This trait had been passed on to myself also, and that on entering locations where there are present portals and dimensional weak spots, as though thinner veils between dimensional positions, I would be rather sensitive to them, and who knows what anomalous situations may manifest. For the nature of his father's work had resulted in his basement becoming as a portal, for which access to the physical from other dimensional positions could be so, and with sensitive individuals they can serve as triggers or conduits by which these portals can become active, and he couldn't predict what may take place. I was adamant, however, and on asking him when we could embark on our adventure, his response would be, no time like the present, as he gestured to his wall of ticking clocks. The scene fading, and where we would find ourselves now, in the basement of his father's house, the home of my great-grandfather on my mother's side, although it appeared at odds with how it should have been, that rather than a basement, it was more an expansive and extensive cave system. Immediately I was struck with the sense of heaviness, an ominous foreboding, as though eyes were watching from dimensions other than our own, licking their chops at the prospect of accessing the dimensional position we were in from where they resided. There the experience would end, and again the hint and possibility of a physical level assignment perhaps, with potential beneficial promise in regards to both of my great-grandfathers, as their respective houses are still standing, and based on the revelations of these real-side experiences, that which I shared here and those previously, both houses are potential portal access points. Therein lies the opportunity to locate these buildings, and perchance find the great-grandfather who was my father's grandfather, the dimension he fled to, or utilizing in some manner the portals as residing in the basement house of my other great-grandfather, my mother's grandfather.